Hello, my name is Father Gregory Pine, and this is Pints with Aquinas. And in this episode, we're going to talk about the existence of God. Shocker, I know. Specifically, we're going to talk about these arguments that you sometimes hear, like, if God can't make a square circle, perhaps God is not omnipotent. And if God is not omnipotent, then perhaps he is not God. So you'll sometimes come across things like this, and when we hear them, we're like, yeah, that's silly. And then we think about it a little bit longer, we're like, wait a second, maybe there's something to it, not in the sense that I no longer believe in God, but in the sense that I clearly don't understand these arguments as well as I could because I am tying myself in mental knots. So, in the interest of untying said mental knots, let's get after it. All right, so I cited the one example, but there are others. What are some others? Can God make a rock too heavy for him to lift? This is a question which you sometimes hear. People will say, like, if he can, well then the fact that he can't lift it signifies some limitation. But if he can't, the fact that he can't make it signifies some limitation. So therefore, God is not omnipotent. Or people will ask whether or not God can undo the past. Okay, so like things have happened. We look back at those things, we're like, look at those things that have happened. And then we're like, God, man, my life, a series of dubious moral choices and terrible regrets. Can you undo them? And most religious believers say, no, God can't undo them. Does that pose a limitation? Well, when we're confronted by these kind of like gotcha type questions, it's helpful to return to principles and then just to think it through in a kind of patient way. So one, I think it's helpful when talking about God's power or God's omnipotence to think about it first in terms of possibility. So power corresponds to possibility. So you wouldn't consider someone powerless if they can't do something that itself can't be done. All right? That's just what we're going to talk about during the course of this video. It's just going to be like the unpacking of that very arcane statement. Okay, so when St. Thomas talks about possibility, and here I am drawing from articles by John Whipple and Lawrence Dewan. When St. Thomas talks about possibility, he says there's two basic senses of possible. One, there's the type of possibility which just names a thing that's not contradictory, okay? So it's conceivable, or it's intelligible, or there isn't something involved in the concept itself which rules another part of the concept out, okay? So an example of something that is intelligible is like a flying human being. So you can conceive of a human being who somehow had like super added strength or levitation or something like that, who would still be a human being, but would have the capacity to fly. Now, are we going to see this anytime soon? I don't know. Hard to say. Squirrel suits, they're really just going bonkers these days. Hoverboards, Back to the Future made it sound like it was just around the corner. Maybe they are. I don't know exactly. Okay, so that's something that's conceivable. So it's not inherently contradictory. The second sense of possibility names something with reference to a power. So not only is it conceivable, but we can refer it to someone or something which can bring it about. All right? So this second sense of possibility is founded on the first sense of possibility. So you can only imagine someone or something that can bring a thing about if the thing itself is bring aboutable. Okay? So when we're talking about things like square circles, we're talking about unintelligible concepts, and as a result of which, unintelligible things. So it doesn't pose a threat to God's omnipotence that he can't make a square circle, because God is being, all right? Being is intelligible, all right? So when we talk about something like a square circle, we're talking about non-being, because we're talking about something that is unintelligible. All right, so it's not as if there is something out there in the ether called a square circle, and it just lacks some kind of agent, someone or something to bring it about. No, it's not out there in any ether, because it isn't. And as a result of which, it can't be spoken of in an intelligible way, and so it can't be referred to a power in an intelligible way. Boom. So that's just like the baseline. When thinking about possibility, we ourselves operate within the bounds of being. That is not a limitation. That's just the fact of the matter. Like analytic philosophers sometimes refer to brute facts, those places of departure, which you don't call into question, but which you just deal with on account of the fact that they are, okay? And for us, you think about it in our human setting, in our human context, that doesn't represent a limitation. It doesn't represent something like that impinges upon our liberty or our freedom. So we are human beings, and so we act out of our human natures, and as a result of which, we find our freedom within the bounds of that human nature and that human activity. So we wouldn't consider it a limitation of our humanity that we can't see as acutely as an eagle, because we don't hunt small woodland creatures from a height of like 100 meters above the surface of the earth. So it's not a limitation for us, okay? Might it be nice to see a little bit better, especially for those who have to wear glasses? Yes, but what we're talking about is being expressed in this nature, which acts for this end. All right, and we're talking about God. We're talking about very being itself, subsisting through itself. So there's nothing that is foreign to God. So all that is pre-exists in God, both in the way that he conceives of it, but also in his essence, because all being, all created being, is on loan from God. All created being subsists in God, who gives that being by kind of entrustment to created things. So when we talk about square circles, we're not talking about anything. We're just playing word games, all right? So there's nothing there to actually lay hold of, whether in the order of being or in the order of thought, because it isn't, so it can't be thought. Okay, as I like make hand gestures outside of the frame of the camera, which is exceedingly helpful. All right. So then when talking about possibility, all right, when we're talking about God specifically, we wouldn't say that it's a limitation of God that he can't do things that are unintelligible. Okay, so like lifting a rock too heavy for him to lift. First, ground clearing. Okay, God doesn't have a body. So we need to purify our thinking about God, our speaking about God, to reflect the fact that God is a pure spirit. So God isn't doing like exercises in the gym. All right, God doesn't enroll himself in, what are some forms of like primal fitness, I think is the name of a gym in Washington, D.C., right when you get off 395 on New York Avenue. God isn't a member of primal fitness, all right? He doesn't need to be because he's not engaged in this type of activity. So that's the first thing when we're talking about it. The second thing is to say that when we're talking about a rock too heavy for God to lift, we're referring the weight of a thing to its creator, who makes it to be. All right, so God's interaction with this rock is of a very different sort. God causes it to be. God gives it its proper rocky agency, right? So it's like that thing is referred to God in a way in which God is not referred to that thing. So we talk about mixed relations when describing created things. We depend upon God for everything. God doesn't depend upon us for anything. We don't change God, okay? God changes us. God makes us to change and to be changeable. So when it comes to a rock too heavy for God to lift, all right, we're talking about an unintelligible thing which just misconceives the relationships that obtain between creation and God and creation, all right? And then I think I mentioned another one, which is like undoing the past. So we, for instance, are time-bound, which is to say that we think in steps and we live in steps and we proceed to the goal of our lives in steps. And that's part of our nature. That's part of who we are. And as a result of which, that's just how we experience reality. So it's what would you say? It's inescapable, all right? Whereas God is eternal, okay? So for God, he possesses all of his life in one whole and simultaneous embrace. So that's just the way in which eternity is described by St. Severinus Boethius, which is to say that all things are present to God because God causes them all to be, but in a way that's proper to their nature, all right? In a way that is proper to their nature. So God gives natures to be and gives natures to cause, which have a kind of integrity to them. And God, in creating them, creates them with the intention of upholding their integrity, because God's plan is good, right? So God's not like constantly revisiting his plan and tinkering around with it. God makes a thing to be good because God makes something that is wise. God makes something motivated by love, as it were, all right? And as a result of which it reflects the intelligibility, it reflects the love which abides at the heart of God. So One, God has no reason to undo the past because nothing escapes from his providence and he's able to orchestrate all things to the praise of his glory. But also two, God has made us with the types of natures which are time-bound, which grow in a time-bound manner, which proceed towards its end in a time-bound way. And so for God to kind of go back on that would seem to suggest that his plans were not wise or that his plans were not loving from the start, from the inception. And then there is a kind of, like a metaphysical law that works itself out in all of reality. That's not to say that like the law is developing in time. It's just a law. Because we're talking about being, we're talking about something that is, and we can know it insofar as it is. And with respect to the past, we're talking about being that transpired in time and has brought us to the present as we currently experience it. So to talk about changing the past means in a certain sense to like upset the very order of reality. It means to posit a contradiction at the heart of creation, which, yeah, I suppose it's a fascinating thought experiment, but it has no traction in the real order. So then the question arises, does God then have to abide by a higher law? No, right? Because God is very being itself, subsisting through itself. And these laws just come forth or kind of issue organically from what is, from being. They're baked into it. So like the law of non-contradiction, for instance, a thing can't both be and not be in the same time and place and in the same respect. All right? So a thing can't be both read and not read in the same time and place and in the same respect. All right? That's not like a law that comes from out here and forces us to obey it. That's something that's baked into reality. So when you encounter reality, you encounter things and you start thinking about things and their interaction with other things, you discover that this could not be otherwise. This is as such on account of the fact that I'm engaging with reality, right? So it's not like, how do you describe this? These principles are already present in our thinking insofar as once we have engaged with reality, we recognize them to be true. All right? So it's not something that we have to learn in the strict sense, like it comes from out here and it ends up in here. It's something that we come to acknowledge in the course of our interaction with being. So God isn't bound by a higher law. God himself is that higher law, namely the eternal law. All right? And our participation in it, by like the natural law, for instance, is an impress of that eternal law, such that we are but pale shadows of what subsists in God wholly and fully. All right, so God's not bound by some higher thing. God just is in a way that's intelligible, in a way that's coherent, in a way that's motivated by wisdom and love. Because, as St. John Damascene describes God, he is an infinite ocean of substance, the depths of which cannot be sounded, the limits of which cannot be known. All right, and we just live towards that horizon with the expectation that when we swim for all eternity in that, we will find it to be true. We will find it to be good. We will find it to be beautiful. So I don't think we have to be worried about these types of questions, though they pose to us good examples of, occasions for further thought on what it means, to be God, or like what it means to be more basically. So yeah, those are some simple reflections. And I now have some announcements. Check out Godsplaining for episodes on Thursdays for 30 minutes and on the weekends with meditations on the sacred scriptures, some guests, some live streams. That's a podcast to which I contribute with 4 other Dominican friars. And we have some retreats coming up this summer. So check that out at godsplaining.org and sign up for it. And also, the Dominican friars are currently running a fundraising campaign called Friars for Life. So if you would check that out on opeast.org or on dominicanfriars.org. So those are both great resources for supporting the work of the Dominican friars in the Eastern Province a little more broadly. And then, this is Pints with Aquinas. So if you haven't yet, please do subscribe to the channel, push the bell, and get updates on further content, which will be sent to your inbox. So my prayers are for you. Please pray for me, and I'll catch you next time on Pints with Aquinas.